I am Zong.
And I'm Claw. This is the start of our mini-series on brief histories where we take a look at geeky moments in the past.
And in today's episode we are looking at the 5th generation of consoles.
So you may be wondering why start at the 5th generation rather than right from the beginning. Well, given the current setup of consoles, the 5th generation is kind of the turning point where Sony entered the fray and things really kind of got going from there. It's also the last generation of consoles where there was more than 3 players with skin in the game. The 5th generation saw the start of the 3D revolution, with a lot of people trying to get consoles out there that would give you the 3D graphics only being seen on PCs and the arcades. Early contenders in this fight were the 3DO interactive multiplayer, the Atari Jaguar. A big standout of the Atari Jaguar is unlike most of the other consoles in the generation that were bragging about their 32-bit credentials, the Jaguar was out there trying to tout itself as the first 64-bit console, although many disputed that claim as it was actually a bunch of 32 chips kind of running in tandem with each other. The 3DO, on the other hand, was coming from Panasonic and a bit of a consortium, and they were very, very pricey. You know, they really didn't stand a chance of like mainstream success because they were just hundreds of pounds more expensive than what was out there. Other honourable mentions of the generation was the Amiga CD32, only seen in Europe, Australia and Brazil from memory, until Commodore went bust. The PC FX, which was NEC's last console ever on the market, after their success with TurboGrafx. Apple also had a foray into the market with the Apple Bandai Pippin, and Sega tried to double dip with the introduction of the 32X, which was designed as a cheap introduction to the 32-bit gaming age. However, the 3 main runners of the generation was the Sega Saturn, the introduction of the PlayStation, and the arrival of the Nintendo 64. Both the Sega Saturn and the PlayStation launched in late 1994 in Japan, that being November the 22nd for the Sega Saturn and December the 3rd for the PlayStation. The N64 wouldn't join until a year and a half later, in June of 1996. As was quite often the case at the time, the rest of the world had to wait several months before they saw these systems in their hometown. This often led to a lot of import consoles. I remember at the time seeing an N64 running on a TV in a shop that could only manage to show it in black and white because of the differences between Japanese and UK televisions, which was a bit interesting that people were so desperate to play these things that, you know, they'd even put up with like lower qualities and all the rest of it just to get a chance to play the next best thing from Japan. The Sega Saturn was initially designed with 2D graphics as the prime focus of the system, as was the case for the previous generations. But when they caught wind of what Sony was up to with the PlayStation, they quickly had to change tack and add components to the system that would make it better at doing 3D graphics. This led to the system being a bit more complicated to develop for, because it had 3 or 4 different chips inside it that made the developers' time a little bit tricky. Also meant that their development software for the 3D elements was somewhat underdeveloped. Unlike the PlayStation, which Sony had gone out and out from the start, knowing that they wanted to make a 3D system. So it was very simple, a bit like people were used to from PCs. If you just have a processor and you have a graphics chip, end of story. And that was one of the things that kind of led to, the inevitable success of the PlayStation in the end. Meanwhile, Nintendo were a lot later to things, having spent quite a bit of time initially working with Sony on what was being dubbed at the time the Play Space Station, which was meant to be a CD add-on for the SNES. which later, after the Nintendo and Sony parted ways, is what Sony then took on to become the PlayStation, while Nintendo looked for an alternative route. At the time, a company that I think is now long disappeared into the ether, Silicon Graphics, who were known for making supercomputers that were used for the likes of like rendering Toy Story and other early sort of CGI type movies or special effects. They were kind of out looking for somebody to partner with to make a more consumer friendly item, so Nintendo and Silicon Graphics ended up getting together and producing the N64, named after the fact that the N64 is a true 64-bit system, unlike the other two, which are both running at 32 bits. Out of the gate, the PlayStation had some, big advantages over the Sega Saturn, had the simpler architecture for people to design against, and also Sony managed to blindside Sega by being able to come in at $100 less than the Sega Saturn was, which was a huge thing. However, both the systems also brought in with them the use of CDs rather than cartridges for delivering games, which then meant that the games themselves could also be considerably cheaper on the market. Unlike the N64, when it did eventually arrive, while the console itself was actually quite a bit cheaper than the other two, the games were then sort of £20-30 more expensive because they were still using cartridges. So the Sega Saturn actually, despite having now disappeared into the annals of time and not remembered by a lot of people, had a very good start, mostly due to it launching with Virtua Fighter as one of its launch games, which was a very popular beat 'em up in Japan, leading to the Saturn outselling the PlayStation by almost 2-1 in that first kind of holiday season of sales in Japan. Unfortunately, Sega couldn't then follow up that success when the consoles eventually launched in the West, because by then sort of the big comparison point was the PlayStation had a near perfect arcade port of the first Ridge Racer game, whereas the Sega Saturn sort of comparable title was Daytona USA, which unfortunately they didn't do such a good job on porting that to the Saturn, again due to the fact that the hardware in the system had some interesting quirks which actually took quite a few years for people to get a handle of. Also, Sony, very much fueled by being dropped by Nintendo, had a real fire behind them, and they really wanted to make the system a success. So they used their considerable wealth to spend a lot more money on advertising and really push out the message of the PlayStation, especially sort of in America and a lot of the West, which led to, that along with Ridge Racer really led to the PlayStation getting a good early foothold and sort of start pulling away from the Sega Saturn while that was still sort of struggling to find its feet in the new sort of 3D world. That was then sort of the next sort of nail in the coffin on that was Namco managed to poach some of the developers from Virtua Fighter, who then went on to create Tekken, which launched in the arcades on a Namco system that was actually built using the chips from the PlayStation, which then obviously meant that when they did the console launch of it on PlayStation, it was nigh on 1-to-1 mapping between what you were playing in the arcades versus what you had on the console. Sega followed that up quite swiftly with Virtua Fighter 2, which they did a far, far better job of porting that onto the Sega Saturn. It was high resolution in the first Virtua Fighter, better textures, everything. And, even to this day, Virtua Fighter 2 on the Saturn is probably one of my favourite beat 'em up experiences, because they really nailed that one. But unfortunately, by that point, it was probably a little bit too late. Other antics that Sony went into, as I like to call them, you'll probably notice as I get into this a little bit more that I'm a little bit bitter that the PlayStation shut down the Saturn quite so successfully, but it really was money. Sony just poured money into this thing like there's no tomorrow to make sure that it's stuck. They went around, there's buying up third-party licenses, the number of games at the time that I remember reading about in magazines and getting excited about them for, because they were both coming out on the Sega Saturn and the PlayStation, and then suddenly 2-3 months later it's a PlayStation exclusive because Sony got out their checkbook and went, hey, here you go, Mr. Developer, stop making that for the Saturn. And I think because the Saturn was also a bit of a pig to develop for anyway, a lot of the developers were like, wait, so we can get a bunch of money from Sony and not have to worry about developing on the Saturn? Okay, we're down with that. And I think really it's the first time where paid for exclusives really became a thing. We have Sony to thank for that one. Prior to that, a lot of the exclusives on Nintendo and Sega systems were, purely because the SNES and the Mega Drive were different enough from each other that it really did only make sense to develop for one or the other for a lot of people.
As you can see, we are trying to stay non-biased as possible. Unfortunately, Claw has this habit of letting his emotions get in the way of true fact.
What do you mean, true fact? The Saturn was the better system, damn it.
Okay. Anyway, back to the show.
So, finally, the N64 decided to join the party.
Finally.
And it did really hit the ground running. Nintendo, as per, normal, really knew what they were doing when they launched the system, and they came out the gate swinging. The console landed. Not very many games, however, it did include Mario 64 as a launch game.
Hell yes, it did.
Which, to this day, is still, one of the best 3D platformers ever made.
And the hardest.
True. I think a key thing with Mario 64 when that came out was on the Saturn and the PlayStation, people had made a few attempts by this point to try and do platforming games in 3D. There was some mild success, but on the whole they had slightly awkward control schemes, camera angles that were just horrible to have to work with, and then Mario 64 arrives, the control scheme was perfect, and obviously part of this was because the N64 shipped as standard with an analog stick on the controller. Now, a few months before the N64 came out, Sony had released the DualShock controllers on the PlayStation, which introduced the two twin analog sticks as we know them today. But, that was a recent addition. It had very much been in response to the fact that they had seen that the N64 was coming with an analog control as a standard thing, and I think they realised what that was going to bring to 3D gaming. So that was a really big boon of Mario 64 and some of the other games that were on the N64 in the early days, was that everything was able to develop with these new analog controls in mind. An interesting thing I remember from the year the N64 came out was there's a gaming mag that on the front cover had the best games of 1996 on it, of which there were 3 games. One of those was Mario 64 on the Nintendo 64. One of those was Quake for PC. And the third one of those was Nights into Dreams on the Sega Saturn. So the first thing I'll point out here is there was not a PlayStation game in sight. So while the PlayStation, was absolutely romping it at the time, but it was very much a quantity over quality system, I think, already after like the first year or so. The way that Sony have done things all the way through of just getting lots and lots of games that appeal to lots of different people has been very much the priority to them, whereas Nintendo and Sega were still following that. We want to have a bit of quality out there, which showed in like 1996 when they had 2 of the best games were on those 2 consoles. Nights into Dreams was also another sort of flagship game for analog controls, with the Sega Saturn again having a new controller released in a similar vein to what the Dreamcast controller ended up being, which at the time was an amazing controller. I still have one. The last time I picked it up and handed it, I was like, oh my god, the analog stick on this is hideous. Oh, it's a pad on a ball, and it was great at the time. But yeah, I'm glad to see that analog sticks have gone more of the PlayStation route. That is something that Sony really did nail first time. Arguably the PlayStation did have then the best analog sticks of the lot. For starters, they introduced the dual stick idea, whereas both Nintendo and Sega only had a single analog stick on their analog controllers. And as amazing as the N64 pad is, the stick on it's just very loose, I think. I think that's where Sony kind of nailed it, is they gave it that little bit more weight. I always found the N64, you're still going to the extremes all the time because it is so easy to push that stick around.
And I find with the N64 stick, wasn't it more... it wasn't fully round, the plastic around it, it was more hexagon. So
they put little kind of notches on it so you could get your 8 directions easily still. Which I think was a nice idea for introducing people to analog controls, but as people have got used to these things, it's become definitely not necessary and would be an absolute pain in the arse in modern games, to be quite frank. But with saying that the N64 got a lot of its success because they landed in the market with their trademark mascot that everybody loved and adored in an amazing game, you'll notice that at no point so far have I mentioned Sonic. Because for some unbeknown, crazy reason, Sega didn't launch with a Sonic game. They were developing a 3D Sonic game that was supposed to have been out until late 1996, but for a number of reasons ended up getting canned. They started developing a new 3D Sonic game that they eventually ended up giving up trying to make for the Sega Saturn, and eventually became Sonic Adventure on the Dreamcast. So the Saturn was very much flying without its flag bearer for the entirety of the time. I mean, you did have some Sonic games on there. You had Sonic R, which admittedly is an awesome fun game. You had Sonic 3D, which was a game that actually came out, I think, on the 3DX, the 32X, as well as the Sega Saturn. Obviously, the Saturn version was quite a bit better, but that was the isometric 3D view, so it was actually all in 2D sprites, but in that kind of old school 3D angled map kind of thing. And again, it was an awesome game, but it wasn't that killer Sonic the Hedgehog game that the Saturn really needed. And I think to this day a lot of people are still just mystified as to how Sega dropped the ball on that one quite so spectacularly, especially while they had Sony breathing down their necks. Which I always felt was a little bit unfair, because really Sony got into this whole thing to get back at Nintendo for dropping them. And somehow Sega were the ones who ended up being a casualty of the whole situation, which, I'm not bitter about at all, honest. But, them's the shakes. The Sega Saturn is still one of my all-time favourite consoles, and had a lot of very kind of interesting, different, quirky games that Sega came out with, which they then continued on the Dreamcast. But I think they did, unfortunately, lose their way in not, relying on some of the stuff that had made them popular in the past. I think probably just to quickly cover a few more highlights of the generation. Unfortunately, I can't talk much more about the Sega Saturn on that, because unfortunately, it had some gems. It had Panzer Dragoon. Wipeout did get an appearance on the Sega Saturn with the original one. Tomb Raider, again, the first game, did appear on the Sega Saturn until it got taken over by Sony. Resident Evil, again, was on both systems for the first attempt, and then just stuck with Sony after that because the install base, just wasn't there with the Saturn. Obviously, the PlayStation highlights, as we've already mentioned, Tekken, Ridge Racer, was by far the place to play Resident Evil. Unfortunately, Wipeout 2097, did what Wipeout did, just a million times better, with an awesome soundtrack, which, you know, really kind of propelled that series into the limelight, again, with the PlayStation brand behind it. Final Fantasy jumped ship from Nintendo and again moved over to PlayStation. Final Fantasy VII, arguably the most popular Final Fantasy game sort of that there ever has been, as much as it's not very many people's favourites, weirdly enough. But you then had Final Fantasy VIII and Final Fantasy IX on that system. And of course Crash Bandicoot and Spyro the Dragon also saw their debuts under the PlayStation brand. The N64, I think, had a somewhat smaller catalogue of games over the generation, but it was very much kept alive by a core of utterly amazing games. So obviously it came out the gate with Mario 64. They followed that up with Mario Kart, Zelda Ocarina of Time. They had the pleasure of hosting GoldenEye on the system, which, you know, to this day, I don't think anything's beat 4-player split-screen GoldenEye. It was just one of those moments in gaming history that anyone who had the pleasure of being young enough to experience it, you know, will always remember, you know, that as like their first proper first-person shooter, multiplayer, you know, laugh with friends. That really delivered very well. But again, I think after that, the N64 just kind of relied on that. Well, I suppose it introduced Perfect Dark to the world, but it didn't have the number of highlights that the PlayStation had. But it did introduce more things for Nintendo, because Smash Brothers came from the N64 as well. So, you know, we've got a lot to thank the N64 for, but I think a bit like today, it was very much the Nintendo games. You know, very little else really stood out on the system. I think in a brief term, that pretty much like covers the generation, really. The PlayStation saw a revised like mini model, which I think ended up selling ridiculously well, leading to the PlayStation being the first system to sell over 100 million units of, you know, any console. It was no mean feat, and, you know, they were still producing and selling the PlayStation right up to literally months before the PlayStation 3 released. So, you know, they kept that system going most of the PlayStation 2 generation as well, because you had this little £99 console that was just had a huge catalogue of games, and for a lot of people, you know, that was more than what they needed, while the, you know, core gamers moved on to the PlayStation 2 and the Dreamcast and the GameCube, whereas, you know, sort of Nintendo and Sega both dropped the Saturn and the N64 like a lead balloon as soon as their new systems came out, pretty much. As we started
looking into this, like doing a bit of research for this episode, I didn't realise that the PlayStation came out before the N64. From my memory serves me correctly, I had an N64 first, then I had a PlayStation.
Which I don't think is uncommon when we're like teenagers and children, especially back then when you didn't really have the internet to promote things to you. You pretty much knew about what your friends knew about. So if all your friends had N64s, then, you know, you didn't hear so much about the other systems.
And I've said to you previously, the only game I ever had for it was Super Mario 64 from obviously memory again. But with my sister's friend, we did borrow GoldenEye, and I've played other Bond games, and the N64 GoldenEye just beats it all. Even though the girl kept on running in front of you every time you want to shoot someone, apart from that, you know.
And you couldn't let anybody play as Oddjob.
No.
Because, you know, that was you couldn't shoot. What? Who thought of that? Well, you can't aim up and down, and you then have a character who's half the height of everybody else. I mean, how was that fair?
And then when we did get the PlayStation, the games that really stand out for me when we first got it would have been Driver. Even though I've tried to replay the first Driver, and that first tutorial in the garage is dreadful. It was dreadful back then. It's still dreadful. Because you have to do like a 180 turn. You have to do some kind of trick, and it takes forever, and the steering's really bad on it. But Driver, the first game, was the better game out of them all.
Well, that is the crazy thing of going back to some of these. I know everyone loves retro gaming and this kind of thing, but I think probably more so than the older generations, going back to this generation of consoles and trying to play the games with the first attempts at various 3D controls and all the rest of it, it is janky as hell.
I've recently tried to play the first Tomb Raider again. It being on PC, but the controls on that, it is very... nowadays it's very smooth. You move your analog stick and they move. As like the first Tomb Raider, it's like forward, back, left, right. There's none of this like turn diagonally here, turn diagonally there. It is very, okay, we'll turn this way a bit, we'll move that way. It's very more precision.
Oh yeah, and again, because that came out, I think, before any of the analog controllers in the consoles, so that was very much a designed for D-pads and keyboards kind of control scheme, which is kind of shocking to think about now.
And even though I would love to say I played my favourite Final Fantasy, which is number 8 by the way, on PlayStation when it first came out, I don't think it was until we got a PlayStation 2 that I was introduced. I think I got introduced with Final Fantasy X when the PlayStation 2 came out.
Yeah.
And then I kind of was liking that, okay, I want to backtrack a bit, and I think we got 8.
Yeah, so I played 7 a bit on the PC, because I never had a PlayStation. Played on friends' PlayStations quite a bit. But then when I tried playing 8 on a friend's, because they went for that more realistic kind of look to the characters, I found it really difficult to see what was going on. It just looked bad.
I remember playing a bit of 7. I didn't even get past the train because I didn't understand how you were like this. At the time, I can remember why you were a small figure person, then when you fought, you were a full-size person. And I think that was what put me off it. With 8, you were never that shrunk, you were always the same size. And with 8, I like the fact that the background, even though it was basically 2D, where you were was 3D, and and as you went up the stairs, the scenery moved with you, even though it was like,
yeah,
what I mean. I think that's what I like about 8. It was that it wasn't just all this 3D stuff. They kind of.
Oh yeah, and I know that Square have tried to keep this tradition going, but Final Fantasy, probably from 7 onwards, hasn't just been about being like a good JRPG. They've always had a very strong focus on wanting to do the best possible graphics they can with the system, and also the best possible CGI. At least they used to, until they don't need to bother with CGI anymore.
And I will say that the best move they did was add voice actors. Even though I play 8 a lot, and I've played 8 over and over again, I stopped reading what they were saying. As with Final Fantasy X, it's nice that you can sort of actually enjoy the game more without having to read loads of dialogue before you get into something. You can just kind of sit back and relax and watch and hear what's going on, and then get back into the game.
Oh yeah, and I think Final Fantasy X really gave me my love for JRPGs, because it was that first time it was really accessible. I mean, it was also then it now takes over a year from when the game comes out in Japan to when the game comes out anywhere else, because of doing all of the localization and re-recording all the voices, because at the time, I'm guessing for money reasons, they didn't do it all in tandem, whereas obviously now they just go, well, we'll do all of the recording in one go with different actors and do it that way.
And unfortunately, I cannot remember owning a Sega Saturn. I want to say my granddad did. I know he had a Sega Mega Drive, but I don't know about the Saturn. I remember the word Saturn moved around the house a lot. If we had one, I'm not sure.
Yeah, well, you've also got to look at it that they sold over 100 million PlayStations. They didn't even sell 10 million Sega Saturns. That's how big the gap got. I think the N64 was 38 million, somewhere around that region. But it's still, Sony really cemented themselves as a force to be reckoned with. Without too many spoilers, it really was only Microsoft coming along in the next generation that stopped Sony from completely running away with it. And even then, Microsoft's only kind of a bit of a thorn in their side rather than anything else. But they at least keep Sony honest in the modern age, I think. So, hope you enjoyed our brief history of the 5th generation of consoles. Please feel free to message us, write us about how you felt about the way we've presented this. Obviously, any questions that you might want us to address in future episodes as well would be interesting. I think have it going back to revisit these things in the future is going to be a good thing.
If you would like to send your comments or any recommendations for us to discuss, you can do this through Gmail at zonclawgeekout@gmail.com, on Facebook at ZongandClawGeekOut, or on Twitter at ZongClaw.
We hope you've enjoyed the show, and this is goodbye from me, Claw.
And a goodbye from me, Zong, and as always guys, keep it geeky.